to use an English expression, on the fly. Okay? I've got about 40 minutes, have I?
Yes.
Okay. Because I think it's very, very useful in sessions like this to make them conversational. Yeah? In other words, to think about what has been said and to see how you respond and where you are going to develop your thoughts. But there is a good sequence, and I said this to Valeri. There's a sequence in which we have a discussion, as it were, of the philosophical premises that surround realism. My ideas, particularly in relation to the quantitative program of the social sciences, and Nell Phil-Haynes, who's somebody I know very well indeed, is going to take you into a very applied domain of this kind of work. And I'm going to start off really by developing on the materialist premise that I just talked about. So the British cultural theorist Raymond Williams, is this someone whose name is at all familiar to any of you here? Yeah? Okay. Williams, in a very, very interesting series of conversations he was having with the British journal New Left Review, made a point about statistics, right? And it's a point I really very much agree with. He said that if you look at the emergence of statistical measures, they emerge at a time when the kind of society, by which he means industrial society, was unknowable without such measures, right? It was an essential thing for the tools of governance, of government, initially of public health, okay? Because remember that until the middle of the 19th century, or even somewhat beyond that, no urban population in the world could reproduce itself, right? It couldn't. The rate of infant and child mortality in cities was so horrific, yeah, that no urban population could reproduce itself. The cities grew purely by the surplus population of rural societies moving into them. And he's talking about Britain, the first urbanized society in the world, which was urbanized by the middle of the 19th century, afflicted by epidemics of cholera, a mass pandemic of tuberculosis, very high rates of infant mortality and child mortality, okay? So the state, some of the very first state interventions in policy are public health interventions. And they don't even have a theory of disease that is right, because they don't have a germ theory of disease. They simply have a miasmic theory of disease. But what they do is they remove human waste from the cities by sewers, and they bring in clean water, yeah? And this is the most transformational element in urban life, yeah? Okay? It's the most transformational element. Smaller towns could exist because farmers used to come in and cart away human shit because it was useful, because they could put it on the fields as a fertilizer. When the town got too big for that to be an economic activity, you had cholera epidemics. That's exactly what happened, okay? So there's a sense in which statistics are emergent, yeah, are describing things. The first thing that's measured is death, right? Now, is death a social construction? There are some social constructionists, extreme social constructionists, who argue that it is. However, you go off. You start to smell after a time, okay? You are dead, okay? Right? Is birth a social construction? I don't think any woman who has ever given birth would be inclined to believe that birth is a social construction, right? Now, I'm not saying that everything isn't as real, yeah, as that, but I'm saying that some things are. And I'm saying, again, with Weber, things are real in their consequences, but there's a kind of continuum of reality. There are material realities, yeah, like the material reality of urbanism, the material necessity for statistics. And the best statistics are simply the measures, the counts, right? Because we have another, statistics means three things. This is my first lecture on statistics, every time. Statistics means counts of things, births, deaths, vital statistics. One of the badges of a failed state is that it cannot collect vital statistics, right? Can't record the births and it can't record the deaths. Yeah? We used to count marriages as that, but marriages are no longer a vital statistic, yeah? Because, you know, it's going out of fashion, right? It's going out of fashion. Then there are the bunch of techniques based on probability, originally derived from ideas in that very important domain of probability known as gambling, yeah, which become the techniques of mathematical statistics based on probabilistic reasoning. And then there's a third meaning, which is quite a nice one, that is statistic, the measure derived from a sample of something, yeah, as opposed to the parameter, which is the actual real value of it in the population, yeah. But so there's a relationship between the measures and the techniques we use to deal with them. And of course, what's interesting is that statistics develops in the social sciences and then is taken up by the physical sciences, right? Okay, that's the sequence. That's the historical sequence. Statistics are taken up in statistical mechanics and physics. Yeah? They get those ideas from the social scientists using probabilistic ideas, and they take them and they start to use them. And they develop them and they refine them in all sorts of ways. And there's a development as well. Anybody familiar with the work of Andrew Abbott, professor of sociology at the University of Chicago? Well, Abbott is somebody who, I find a lot of Abbott's writing very interesting. He says, look, we seize on an idea of a measure as a variable, and we assign to variables causal powers, and we develop methods, primarily the developments of correlation and regression methods, which are designed to assess the causal capacity of variables, mostly on their own, or partialed out against something else, only very occasionally in terms of statistical interaction. Is there anybody in this room who could define statistical interaction for me? I'm having a dialogue with you. Okay, would anybody like to define statistical interaction? It's a problem for statisticians, but it's actually how reality is. And actually I think whenever you're dealing with data, if you find interaction terms, then that's a clear clue that there is complex causation, right? And probably multiple causation. Well, statistical interaction, at its simplest, means the relationship between two variables is modified by the value of a third. Yeah? At its simplest. At its simplest. I did a big study of the relationship between housing and health. This is where I came to realism. Because it was in doing this study and in trying to make sense of the data that I had that I picked up realist ideas. This was in the 1980s. And I found, surprise, surprise, that when we looked at the quality of social housing, municipal housing, which is very common and was even more common then in the United Kingdom, and the health of people, the better the housing, the better the health. Until you got to old people. And when you got to old people, the better the housing, the worse the health, right? But of course then, one of the interviewers, whenever you're doing surveys, always talk to your interviewers because they will tell you what is really going on, said to me, oh, that's simple, Dave. She said, all these old people are living in sheltered accommodation, which is a special form of accommodation. And how did you get into sheltered accommodation, which was uniformly good and very highly regarded by the people who lived there, and people wanted to get into it? You got into it by being ill in the first place. So the causal mechanism had turned around, right? The general causal mechanism was good housing meant better health in all sorts of ways. Very important for children, yeah? Because it was very important for respiratory health in children, and we know from longitudinal studies that poor respiratory health in childhood is really significant in terms of poor health outcomes right through your life. Very significant for depression, yeah? But when we looked at the old people, yeah, they were in this very good housing that they'd got into by being ill. That's an interaction, it's real. It's not a trivial one, right? It's actually rather an interesting one, but that's what's going on. So the idea of multivariate analyses, right, which underpins econometrics, yeah? The British Marxist economist Joan Robinson, who wrote very, very intelligently about imperfect competition, referred to econometrics as nonsense hidden behind a thicket of algebra. Okay? So, you know, you have these kinds of ways of thinking about things. What Abbott is saying is he challenges the notion of the variable and variable causation. And there's a very interesting move in this direction, because there was a move which came in psychology in the early 20th century, derived actually from biostatistics. Yeah? And biostatistics is one of the reasons we are all well fed, by the way, right? Biostatistics in agriculture, in agronomy, has massively increased the product, largely the experimental approaches in biostatistics, massively increased the capacity of agricultural systems to feed people. Yeah? It's one of the factors that's been very, very important in applied science. But there was another branch of bioscience which tried to pick up and took this, and it came in psychology, and the technique that emerged out of it is factor analysis, right? Okay? Factor analysis and latent class analysis is simply factor analysis using categorical data rather than continuous data. It's something that Lagerfeld developed in the New School of Social Research in the 1940s. Lagerfeld, very interesting character, involved in a really, really interesting study, Marienthal, the sociography of an unemployed community in Austria in the 1930s, one of the great origins of social survey research and combination, but a mixed method, right? Because here you had Mari Yahoda, who was married to Lagerfeld at the time. They didn't last. Their intellectual perspectives were incongruent, right? I think that's always going to lead to a divorce, okay, but not necessarily. But she of course is one of the founders of modern social psychology, very much in terms of observational social psychology, qualitative approaches to that kind of work. What they were looking at was what it was like to be in this textile town near Vienna in the 1930s when there was mass unemployment, and very much the kind of thing I look at now in terms of the consequences of deindustrialization. Right? Cultural and psychological shock in these contexts. So we had factor analysis, and there was a lot of attempts, and actually one of the reasons I raise this is that Andrew Sayre, okay, somebody I know quite well, his PhD was a geography PhD in which he was using factor analysis to explore industrial systems, okay? And I had a conversation with him about 25 or 30 years ago, and he said, I completely gave up on quantitative stuff, right? Because I thought it was completely non-congruent with a realist program of doing work. But I had picked up realism from a very, very good book from a woman who died tragically young, right? The Survey Method by Catherine Marsh. And there's a research methods centre at the University of Manchester, which is named for Catherine Marsh. And she was writing, and she used this phrase that interaction is something which is really important, and statisticians, conventional statisticians, just think it's a problem. And she said, what we need is a realist program. Yeah? And this is when I was doing this housing and health stuff, and it took me into the housing and health data to think in that way. So I think that the quantitative program is part of a useful program of empirical investigation, ideally conducted as a mixed method project, right? Rather in the way, I don't know if any of you know this book, and I don't know if it's been translated into Russian. It didn't get translated into English until about 1970, but Marienthal, this book, The Sociography of an Unemployed Community. It's a lovely little thin study, right? It's only about that thick, but it's a good book, well worth looking at. So the idea of mixed methods, right, in a particular research project, but also that all of these ways of looking at the world are useful to us in terms of trying to understand what we are doing, okay? And I think the first thing I'm going to say is that counts matter, right? A lot of the time while I've been here, I'm giving a presentation next week at the British Sociological Association in Glasgow, and it's based on an editorial I wrote when I was editor of the British Journal Sociology. We had a special issue on class and culture, and we had received very many very, very good contributions, right? But almost all of these were about the poorest section of the post-industrial working class. And I reflected on it, and I said, we have a missing middle. We have a missing middle, okay? We're not looking at the middle people. And there's a very, very interesting, really useful for me, because just emerged about 2 weeks ago, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have just published a big study on the, to quote Karl Marx, the immiseration of the middle class in post-industrial capitalism, right? Okay? And it's a very good study full of lots of very, very good data telling you about the declining relative living standards of the middle groups in society. The OECD saying the middle groups are really important in society because if they're discontented, that's when you have real trouble, right? Every revolution hasn't been occasioned by the very poor. It's been occasioned by people who are really thought they were relatively well off and then found that they were being shafted in some way. That's why the sailors in Kronstadt, who are a pretty privileged group in some ways in the context of Tsarist society were a very important factor in the October Revolution, right? It's the categories like that when they change. It's the same in the Mexican Revolution. Yeah, if you look at the Mexican Revolution, which is a very interesting revolution to look at. But it's when big social changes happen. At a revolutionary transformation without any violence, the effect of the 1945 general election in my own country was a very, very similar thing, right? It changed things. And it was people reflecting back on the losses of the 1930s, yeah? The New Deal in America, which is, of course, transformational, yeah, is possible because it's the middle people who had been so severely affected in America by the contexts of the great crash of the 1930s. So data is really, really good. And I'm working at the minute with a very big data set, very good data set, prepared by our Office of National Statistics, who are impeccable in their production of their data. Yeah, it's an interesting point that quite a lot of Western Marxists have commented that if a state produces bad data, it's going to have trouble. Yeah, so if you get to the core data, it's usually pretty good. And this is a wealth and assets survey, and I'm simply looking at who has wealth, right? And the different forms of wealth: property wealth, physical wealth, which is physical possessions, which could be just furniture, but could also be a Van Gogh, right? Financial wealth, which is very, very important and very unevenly distributed. And pension wealth, which is very important in the kind of society I live in. So I'm looking at this data and I'm working with it, okay? And what are the tools of quantitative work that I think are congruent with the realist program? Well, one of them, my watch seems to have stopped. What time is it?
It's okay, you have 15 minutes.
Right, so it's 1:30. My watch has stopped. Which so I'm going to put it back. I think I know what's happened. It's just the handles come out. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you tell me. Mm-hmm. There we are. Push it in and it should start again. It was a very cheap watch, so if it's broken, it doesn't matter. Right. I will buy another one in the airport on the way out. Right. The one is a technique which was developed by the political sociologist Charles Reagan, right, called qualitative comparative analysis. Are any of you familiar with this technique? Yeah? You know it, right? Good. But, sorry?
I'm a political scientist, you know.
Yeah, okay, good. So you know it. Right, what Reagan was doing, there's been a turn. If you look at the big macro historical political texts, right? For example, I've forgotten the guy's name, but the one about dictatorship and democracy, yeah, in Europe, or different forms of welfare states, stuff like this. A lot of it is qualitative. A lot of it is qualitative accounts. But there'd been a turn in the United States towards very, very much econometric style, regression-based quantitative investigations of macro socio-political difference. Right? Who's the guy who wrote the book Democracy and Dictatorship? I have a terrible head for news. I'll think of it. Doesn't matter. Oh yeah, Barrington Moore. That's it. Barrington Moore. Right? So what Charles was trying to do was he was trying to say, look, actually our explanations are not variable-based explanations, but they are set theoretic explanations. Right? In other words, it's not a single thing, but it's a set of things. And he picked up a set of techniques based on Boolean algebra, which are actually the computing techniques used by electrical engineers to shift power and telecommunications around systems, right? Because they, something breaks down, you shift it another way, right? He had this set of computing techniques, and he developed this technique called qualitative comparative analysis, which is based on the idea of configurations in relation to an outcome, right? You use the term retroductive, and I prefer that, right? Conventionally, I think a lot of people in realism talk about abductive reasoning, but I see them as the same thing. In other words, it's how did this situation, or whatever it is we have, come to be as it is, yeah? And qualitative comparative analysis allows us to have multiple ways in which it comes to be as it is, yeah? Multiple and different ways, okay? So multiple causation, and configurations which are assemblages, in a way, yeah, of causal factors, right, or allow it to be complex. Yeah? And when I encountered Charles Reagan's work, I immediately saw it as being congruent with my understanding of complex causation. Yeah? And he has agreed that this is true. We managed to edit a big book together on case-based methods in social science. Okay? So I think it's interesting to see that there are techniques which are appropriate. And that's a very good one for causality. One technique that I am very, very keen on is sorting things out. Again, there's a very good Actor Network-based book on this by Bowker and Starr, which is called exactly that, sorting things out. Yeah? I don't buy the extreme, and I'll come back to something about actor network theory in a minute, but it's classifying things is a very good thing to do. There's a famous book by Tukey called Exploratory Data Analysis, right? And this was written in the 1970s. And Tukey said, look, statistics has disappeared and it's gone in the wrong direction. We spend far too much time trying to test hypotheses against data and far too little time seeing what the data is telling us. Yeah? So this is my materialist conception, that quite a lot of the time the data is telling us useful things, right? But this data is not variables, it's traces of complex systems. Yeah? The most recent book I've written is a book on class after industry. And we've had a great transformation in post-industrial societies. And this has affected post-Soviet societies as well. Yeah? I know that it's a big factor in the Russian Federation. Yeah? That places that were fundamentally industrial have ceased to be so. Right? And it's ongoing. This is not like Marienthal in the 1930s, where the Second World War reinvigorated industry, it all came back. Yeah? There's a town in Tyneside where I live called Jarrow, which was completely wiped out because the shipyards were closed, but when you have a war you need ships and you start building ships again. Yeah? We're not going to get that back. Right? There's been a global relocation of that kind of industrial production. This is a profound and important thing to think about. And I see that our statistics are good measures of traces of this system. So I spent a lot of time looking at just simple data about what jobs people do, yeah? What are their occupations, or about the gross value added of different sectors of an economy. By the way, the gross value added of manufacturing is held up much better than the employment, partly because one of the drivers of deindustrialization, globalization is one of them, the other is massively increased productivity in almost all manufacturing industries. These are drivers, these are causes, right? Which I would very much be happy to use in terms of the idea of real. Yeah? Generative mechanisms embedded with themselves within a capitalist system of organization of production. Right? So I think these are things which are interesting. So there are ways in which we can use data, I think, in useful ways to see things about the world. And what's very interesting is that a great deal of this work, seems to be working again, is being done in applied areas. Phil is going to talk to you about that in detail. But a lot of my work has been in health. I work a lot with physicians. I even work a bit with surgeons now. And we're interested in the causes of health, right? And of course the problem is, who costs money for health systems in our sort of society? It's old people, people like me, right? At the minute I'm pretty healthy, okay? I cost the health service almost nothing, right? Okay? But that could change at a minute's notice. Okay, it changed at a minute. Well, it changed a minute twice for my partner, because she suddenly developed a rather complicated and rare condition called aplastic anemia, and then she was knocked over and broke her ankle. Right? Yeah, and she's costing the health service quite a lot of money, and she hadn't cost them anything since she had a baby, sort of 30 years ago. Right? It was the last time she cost the health service anything. She didn't cost them much then because it was an uncomplicated birth. But it's old people, and old people do not have simple conditions; they have multiple conditions. Right? They have arthritis, right? They have other physiological conditions, right? Sometimes they develop depression, they develop Alzheimer's, right? One of the biggest health problems in our world. So what are the causal factors in relation to these outcomes? Mental health on its own. I don't know if this is the same in the Russian Federation, but I think it may be. We have an enormous problem of depression among young men in the West. right? We have enormous numbers of young men who are on antidepressant drugs, okay? And what is the background? What is the background to this? And what will work for doing something about them? Because they are themselves dynamic cases moving through their lives. Is a dynamism, right? What kind of interventions will produce the better outcome, which is the resolution of depression? And depression is a very, very interesting thing, because whenever you look at lay conceptions of health, depression is one which is clearly identified in the lay literature. It's not you're sad, and it's not you can't do anything, and it's not appropriate for you not to be able to do anything. If you've been bereaved, it's fine for you not to be able to do anything for a time. This is a socially appropriate context in which your sorrow will overwhelm your capacity, right? But we have all these other contexts in which something like sorrow, melancholia in the old term, overwhelms your capacity to do things. And I'm working quite a lot with people, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and particularly nurses, because nursing has become highly professionalized in the UK, and these people have master's degrees in nursing, right? In mental nursing, on these kinds of issues, yeah? About how you actually produce systems which will produce better outcomes. A very common one is type 2 diabetes, because type 2 diabetes almost never occurs on its own. It occurs commonly in association. Of course, obesity is a causal factor, but obesity itself is a health problem. But it occurs in association with obesity, very often in association with arthritis, yeah, very often in association with depression. My friend and colleague Frances Griffiths, she's a professor of primary care at in other words, a primary care physician at the University of Warwick Medical School. She talks about, from the GP's point of view, the heart sink patient. This patient comes into your surgery and they sit down in front of your desk and your heart goes, ugh, right? Because they have so many things, all in interaction with each other. What is it which will produce good outcomes at this very important level? Because health is an important, vitally important, and such an expensive part of our kind of social system, about causation. So there's a lot of work, and Phil is going to take this up. Phil's going to talk to you in much more detail about these evaluation mechanisms. Now, have I still got 5 minutes? Yeah. I've got one concluding thing to say to you. We think of social science as an activity of the academy. But most social scientists, when I was young, and that's quite a long time ago, 50 years ago, most social scientists were in the academy. Most social scientists were in the academy. Now most social scientists are not in the academy. We have in the West, and in America for longer, been producing enormous numbers of social scientists, year on year on year, right? I have lived through this massive expansion of social sciences in the United Kingdom, yeah? I've taught literally thousands of students, yeah, over my life. And what are these people doing, right? Many of them are now working as social scientists, but not in the academy, but in the world, right? They are not going to be traditional intellectuals in the Gramscian sense. They are organic intellectuals, many of them in the state apparatuses, yeah? But many of them also now in the private sector, right? And this is interestingly, we have a massive overproduction of PhDs in the West, right? There are far too many people being produced with PhDs for academic jobs. So one of the first things we do at the beginning of people starting on a PhD program is start to tell them other places where they could do jobs, right? And actually they often welcome this, because some of these places, for example, we have a very elite grade within the UK civil service called the research profession, right? This is of the equivalent status economists profession, although they're on the back foot now because they're such rubbish. The statistics profession, right? This is a research profession. And loads of people are working in these areas, loads of people are working in applied health research, loads of people are working out with the academy. But the academy itself has changed, because every university I know of in the English-speaking world